When I was around 12, I lived in a small, quiet town where nothing much ever happened. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and the biggest excitement was the weekly farmers market. Our neighborhood had a little playground right across from my house. My friends and I would spend hours there, swinging on the swings, climbing the jungle gym, and playing tag until the sun dipped below the horizon. My closest friends were Jack, Sarah, and Mike. We were inseparable, a tight-knit group bound by a shared love of adventure and a knack for finding trouble where there seemed to be none. Jack was the ringleader, always coming up with wild ideas and daring us to follow through. Sarah was the practical one, the voice of reason that kept us from getting into too much trouble. Mike was the joker, always ready with a laugh to lighten the mood. And then there was me, the one who loved to tell stories and was always looking for the next great adventure to share. At the end of our street, just past the playground, stood an old, abandoned health post. It had been deserted for as long as I could remember. The building was dilapidated, with boarded-up windows and ivy creeping up its walls. The place had an eerie, unsettling aura that kept most people at a distance. Despite our adventurous spirits, none of us had ever dared to go inside. We would talk about it sometimes, spinning stories of ghosts and hidden treasures. But when it came down to it, the health post remained a mystery we weren't brave enough to solve. That all changed one summer afternoon, when a mix of boredom and curiosity pushed us to the edge of an adventure we would never forget. It was one of those lazy summer days when the heat seemed to melt time, making the hours stretch endlessly. We had exhausted all our usual games and adventures at the playground, and a heavy boredom settled over us like a blanket. Jack, as always, was the first to break the silence. "Let's do it," he said, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Do what?" Sarah asked, already suspicious. "Let's check out the health post," Jack replied, pointing down the street. We all looked in the direction of the abandoned building. It stood there, as it always had, looming at the end of the street like a dark sentinel. A shiver ran down my spine, but the thrill of doing something forbidden was too tempting to resist. "Are you serious?" Mike said, trying to mask his nervousness with a laugh. "Yeah, why not?" Jack challenged. "We've talked about it for years. It's about time we actually do it." Sarah hesitated, but the collective curiosity won her over. "Okay, but just a quick look." With our mission decided, we set off. The walk up the street felt different this time, each step weighed down by a mix of excitement and dread. As we approached the health post, the air seemed to grow colder, and the usual sounds of the neighborhood faded into an eerie silence. The building was even creepier up close. The ivy that covered the walls looked like it was trying to strangle the life out of the place. The windows, boarded up and broken, gave the impression of hollow, watching eyes. The front door, slightly ajar, seemed to beckon us in with a sinister invitation. "Look at this," Mike whispered, pointing to the ground near the entrance. There, just in front of the door, was a skull. It looked like it belonged to some kind of animal, maybe a dog, but its presence was unsettling. Surrounding the skull were a few melted candles, their wax hardened into grotesque shapes. "Who would do this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. We all stepped closer, drawn by a morbid fascination. I reached out, almost touching the skull, when suddenly it moved. The jaw creaked open, and the top half of the skull detached and fell to the ground with a sickening crack. A collective gasp escaped us. Fear gripped our hearts as the reality of the situation sank in. We weren't just playing around anymore. Something was seriously wrong. "Run!" Jack shouted, and we didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the street, our footsteps echoing in the unnerving silence. The health post, with its eerie mysteries, faded into the distance, but the terror followed us home. I remember reaching out towards the skull, my fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the cracked bone. The air around us seemed to grow colder, and an unsettling silence fell over the group. Just as I was about to pull my hand back, the unthinkable happened. The skull's jaw creaked open with a bone-chilling sound, like old, rusty hinges being forced apart. We all froze, our eyes wide with disbelief. Before any of us could react, the top half of the skull detached itself and fell to the ground with a sickening crack. It felt like time had slowed down. Every second stretched into an eternity. Did you see that? Mike stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah took a step back, her face pale. That shouldn't be possible, she muttered, shaking her head as if trying to wake from a nightmare. Let's get out of here. Jack's voice broke the spell of our paralysis, snapping us back to reality. We turned and ran, our feet pounding the pavement as we fled from the health post. My heart was racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. All I could hear was the sound of our frantic footsteps and the blood thundering in my ears. The world around us seemed to blur as we sprinted away, fear propelling us faster than we had ever run before. The street seemed endless, each step taking us further from the source of our terror, but never quite far enough. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see some dark, malevolent force chasing us. But there was nothing, just the eerie, silent building receding into the distance. We didn't stop running until we were back at the playground. Gasping for breath and drenched in sweat, we collapsed onto the grass, our bodies shaking from the exertion and the lingering fear. No one spoke for a long time, the memory of the skull's unnatural movement replaying in our minds. I can't believe that just happened, Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. What was that thing? Mike asked, still trying to catch his breath. I don't know, Jack replied, his bravado gone. But we're never going back there again. I nodded in agreement, the weight of what we had witnessed settling heavily on my shoulders. The health post was no longer just an abandoned building at the end of our street. It was a place of dark, unfathomable secrets. Secrets we had no intention of uncovering. As we sat there, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the playground. The familiar, comforting surroundings did little to dispel the unease that had taken root in our hearts. We had come face to face with something beyond our understanding, and the memory of that skull would haunt us for a long time to come. The next morning, curiosity gnawed at us despite the lingering fear from the previous day. We gathered at the playground, our faces marked by a restless night filled with unsettling dreams. Jack was the first to speak up. We have to go back, he said, his voice determined. We need to see if it's still there. None of us wanted to return, but we knew we couldn't leave the mystery unsolved. With a mix of dread and curiosity, we set off down the street, each step heavier than the last. The closer we got to the health post, the more my stomach churned with anxiety. When we reached the building, it looked just as eerie as before, but something was different. The skull and the candles were gone. We stood there, staring at the empty spot where the macabre scene had been. This doesn't make any sense, Sarah said, breaking the silence. How could it just disappear? Jack knelt down, inspecting the ground for any clues. Maybe someone took it, he suggested. Or maybe it was just a prank. Mike shook his head, a skeptical look on his face. A prank? Who would go to such lengths? And how did the skull move on its own? We spent the next few minutes speculating, our theories growing wilder with each passing second. Some of us thought it was a prank by older kids in the neighborhood. Others, like Mike, leaned towards a more supernatural explanation. The idea that it was some kind of hallucination briefly crossed our minds, but the collective experience made that seem unlikely. Despite our attempts to rationalize what had happened, none of us could shake the feeling that we had encountered something beyond our understanding. The health post, with its decaying walls and silent presence, had become a symbol of our deepest fears. As the days turned into weeks, the incident left a lasting impact on me. I found myself avoiding the street where the health post stood, taking longer routes just to stay away from it. The thought of what we had seen, and the mystery of its disappearance, haunted me. I couldn't look at old buildings without feeling a pang of anxiety, and the dark corners of my own house seemed more menacing than before. The fear of the unknown had taken root in my mind, changing the way I saw the world. What once was a small, quiet town now felt like a place where unseen dangers lurked just out of sight. The health post had revealed a dark, unsettling truth, that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some places are better left unexplored. Reflecting on that summer day, I realized how much the experience at the health post changed me. Before that, the world felt safe and predictable. a place where the scariest things were ghost stories told around campfires. But after witnessing the impossible, my perception of reality shifted. I became more cautious, more aware of the shadows that could hide the inexplicable. I started questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. If a skull could move on its own, what other supernatural forces might be lurking just out of sight? The boundary between the known and the unknown had blurred, leaving me perpetually on edge. I avoided the health post, but its presence loomed large in my mind, a constant reminder of the dark secrets it might still hold. My friends and I often discussed what had happened, but we never reached a satisfying conclusion. Had it been a prank? Some sort of mass hallucination? Or was it truly something supernatural? The questions nagged at us, but we never found any answers. The health post remained a mystery, its secrets locked away behind those boarded-up windows. Even now, years later, the memory of that day haunts me. Sometimes, I catch myself glancing nervously at abandoned buildings, half expecting to see a skull or some other sign of the supernatural. The experience left a lasting impression, shaping the way I see the world. I approach life with more caution, always mindful of the unseen and the unexplained. And at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows grow long, I sometimes hear the faint echo of a skull's jaw creaking open. It's a sound that chills me to the bone, a reminder that some mysteries are best left undisturbed. The health post at the end of the street still stands, silent and abandoned, its dark secrets buried deep within. And though I've moved on, a part of me will always be 12 years old, standing frozen in fear as the skull moved, forever changed by that encounter with the unknown.